Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. And no more important of a public policy is the parental rights of the children. And the mischaracterizations of it are elbow deep in the Commonwealth right now. And he teased this a little bit last time he was on the program, but he's back. He's the director of the Center for Educational Freedom at the Cato Institute, Neal McCluskey, and a brand new book called The Fractured Schoolhouse, Reexamining Education for a Free, Equal, and Harmonious Society. Well, Neal, who could be against that? Welcome back to the show. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm fine. How are you?
Not bad. It's beautiful autumn weekends as we get into it here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And this is now going on 2 years of an awakening, I feel like, amongst parents. We see it, if you want to be as cold as the statistics of the 2021 election and county by county, with the increase in the number of people that had historically voted for Republican candidates because they said we're going to put the parents first. Is this, and I'm prone to metaphor and hyperbole probably more often than that. I've said that this may be almost a build-up to a Lexington and Concord conflict between the authoritarians who are saying, as we watch the walkouts in Virginia, no, these are our children, and the parents who are saying, hold it, when did that happen? Is that what you're sensing? And tell us, what is in this book that will help parents get through these tumultuous times?
Yeah, well, so I think a major reason I wrote this book, it was before the outbreaks of great parent anger that we've been seeing recently in schools, but it was to point out that the public schooling system itself, that public schooling by its very nature, creates conflicts among diverse people. And rather than unifying them, as public schooling was supposed to do, it actually causes division. And I was writing this before the last couple of years, but it just so happens that, in the last couple of years, we've seen tremendous national, widespread examples of public schooling forcing social conflict. But what's disappointing is that it is almost impossible to get most journalists, most media, to cover the fundamental reason that we're seeing these conflicts, and that is we force diverse people with diverse values, backgrounds, desires, to all pay for a single system of public schools. That leaves them no choice but to fight each other for what those schools will do. And so it just so happens Virginia has been ground zero for this, in particular Loudoun County. We've also seen it in Fairfax County, but there have been other counties in Virginia that have seen similar conflicts. These are about fundamental questions like, how do you teach American history? Do you teach the country is fundamentally good with lots of bad things having been done, or that it's fundamentally bad with systemic racism and that we've never really lived up to our ideals? How do you teach about gender? Is it something that is locked in based on the sex you were born at birth? Is it something that can evolve? These are all very basic, very personal, very deep questions that we force people to fight over. And so we're seeing these sorts of conflicts in Virginia, but we're seeing them across the country. Just today, I was reading about in Dearborn, Michigan, a school board meeting basically descended into shouting until the meeting was dissolved because the heavily Muslim population found many of the books that were in the schools morally unacceptable, as we've seen in many other places by many different groups. So what this book says is, look, we've been told in sort of the mythology of public schooling that public schooling brings us all together, and that conversely, choice would cause us to balkanize. If we could all choose our own schools, we'd go off in our own little corners, and somehow also, while we're in our corners in schools, be fighting with each other, which makes no sense. But that's what this book is about. It's about getting at the history, getting at the theory, and getting at the research on whether forcing diverse people into one system of schools or allowing them to have choice leads to more peace and to more equality and ultimately to more togetherness, to more unity.
Neal, let me ask you, this fairly obvious point of it first is as we watch, and perhaps it's just the nature of any organization, any movement eventually gets to the point where it feels like it's comfortable and it goes too far. We had been watching a decade and a half of declining achievement of American school children. And then at some point we start pushing social agenda items while our kids are graduating from high school at breakneck pace, unable to read, never mind, access any other information other than what the teachers told them in the narrative. Is that fuel for this fire? Is that parents are now almost at the point where we're getting into the second generation of a failed system, or adults who have had the system fail them are now having children and saying, hold on, I've been through this movie before, let's not repeat it?
Well, what's interesting is we actually do kind of repeat the same movie over and over and over again. So, pardon me, if you go to the beginning of public schooling, what was called common schooling, which starts in Massachusetts in the 1830s, 1840s, we already start to see people saying, hey, I don't agree on what the schools are doing. Some people said the schools should just teach kind of basic skills. And that's what a lot of parents want now, is they want their kids to learn to read, to write, to do high level, typically pretty high level of math. They probably want them to learn some basic history, some basic science, and other things like that. But they don't want values being imposed on their kids. Other people, though, think the role of the schools is to shape character and to teach an attachment to either maybe to your country, but it could be to your belief in a progressive social change agenda, lots of different things. So we have these fundamental disagreements about what schools are for. We saw this from the very beginning of common schools, and we repeat this process over and over and over again. So in Massachusetts, there was a lot of fighting about which Protestant religion would be taught and respected in the public schools. If you go, you can go then to the 1880s, and the question was, well, do we use public schools to force new immigrants or to coerce new immigrants to give up what they think is important about their background and identity and force them to become Americans? Do we use the system to shape kids to work primarily in factories? That sort of question. You can go to the 1920s and the Scopes monkey trial, which was, of course, about, do you teach evolution in schools? Do you teach creationism? And what does the state, in the case of Scopes monkey, allow? You can go to the 1960s, and we had battles over, prayer gets removed from school. So we've seen the same thing over and over and over again. What seems different now is we have increasingly centralized control over education since the very beginning. If you go back to 1939, 1940, there were 117,000 or so school districts serving a national population about a third of what it is now. Today, there are only about 13,500 school districts, again, now serving 3 times as many people. That is mass centralization. So we used to be able to see people who lived in often unique, kind of homogeneous communities, had schools that they ran and that reflected what they thought was important. But we've had mass centralization all the way to the point where the federal government was on the verge of setting curriculum about 7 or 8 years ago. And the more you centralize, the more you force diverse people into one system, into a single system, and force them into conflict over what's taught. And the other thing is we are becoming much more diverse. We've seen a decline in religion, and we've seen a big increase in the share of the population that's not what not typically old-fashioned. And that's good, I think. It's good that we have a lot of this diversity, that we have more diverse views, more diverse people, but it has and will lead to more conflicts about what the schools teach and how they teach it, because diverse people just have different things they want and different needs, and they cannot be served equally by a single system.
Neal McCluskey is on with us this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, director of the Center for Educational Freedom at the Cato Institute, Cato.org. Neal, you were talking about centralization, and it's a stunning decline in the number of public school divisions. Many years ago, when Governor McDonnell was governor of Virginia, the National Republican Governors Association issued a report about the inner cities, the black communities, especially not respecting, education in the way it was being presented, and it seemed the fruit of that was what became known as Common Core, rather than, and I've been told that it was debated whether to invigorate a charter school system that would allow neighborhoods to start up their own schools within their neighborhoods and decentralize. Would that be something that, and I guess we're counting on a state that controls the licensure of schools to then permit competition with the state-run schools, might be a long wait. But is that something that needs to happen more to get the schools back into a more geographically individualized area?
Yeah, I think that the more we decentralize education, the better. The NGA report that was about the Common Core was actually saying, well, okay, under No Child Left Behind, which was a federal law passed in 2002, the federal government said all students must be proficient by the year 2014 in math and reading, and that they must have uniform state standards and state tests. But what was found under No Child Left Behind was, okay, well, each state had a uniform standard for all its school districts, but the standards and the tests were not the same among states. And so the idea behind Common Core was that we would have at least a whole bunch of states on the same standards using the same test. I mean, the ideal seemed to be every state on the same standard and same test, but Common Core pushed through a federal, in part through a federal effort called Race to the Top, said, look, if you can compete for this Race to the Top money if you are in a group of 26 states or more that share standards, so a majority of states. To my recollection, that wasn't mainly about helping charter schools. That was saying our problem is not enough uniformity instead of too much.
Well, actually, I was told that during these governors' conferences, one of the things that was debated before they came up with the idea to promote Common Core was, as an option, was to actually decentralize. That's what I was getting at. I had talked to Governor McDonnell during that time, and that's what he had told us, is that seemed to be, do we come up with a common system, a race to the top, or do we decentralize it? And the decision was to go with the more centralized approach. That's what I was getting at. I didn't mean to throw a spanner in the works, but so it seems though that here we are at a generation into that, and we have schools teaching to tests because there's money attached to the test scores, rather than using the tests as they had been for years, which was just a landmark of students' progress through a curriculum. Do we need to look at that again, Neal?
Well, we definitely need to look at less centralization. And, pardon me, we actually have moved away from testing to a significant amount, because in 2015, we got rid of the No Child Left Behind Act. It was replaced with the Every Student Succeeds Act, again, federal. It still requires standards and testing, but it at least got rid of those adequate yearly progress requirements, so the test doesn't mean as much to the school, so there's not as much focus on it, because people had gotten basically fed up with education being restricted to a test, or to one or two tests. They wanted a whole lot more of other stuff. But the problem is, again, people don't always agree on what the other stuff is. And so what decentralization does is it enables people to select, especially if money follows the student to the schools their families choose or other educational options, they can choose the values or the way they think history should be taught or the way they think math should be taught or what books should be in the libraries. They can choose that for themselves. They are free to make those decisions. And when they make those decisions, it doesn't require that they be imposed on people who want something different. That's the fundamental reason we see so much conflict now in our public schools, is because we have a system in which if one person wants something different than someone else, they typically have to fight with that other person because they both pay for the same system of schools, basically the same school or the same district, and only one can win. We need to get away from that winner-takes-all system to one where everybody is free to choose. And then we no longer end up being political enemies with neighbors we may not agree with. Right. We can go back to being neighbors.
There was once a philosophy, economic, really, philosophy about funding schools with property tax money, and that the two things you can guarantee are that you're going to have failing schools and gentrification. Do we need to look at, I think it was Prop 13 in California, where they took the school funding away from property tax values and rejiggered the whole way they even did their own property tax collections, and look at a better way to fund the schools even on a local level, so that we're not seeing these neighborhoods falling prey to the very thing that we claimed that the property tax and the composite indexes here in Virginia were designed to fight, which was that poor neighborhoods were going to have poor schools and wealthy neighborhoods are going to have wealthy schools.
Yeah, well, so that kind of funding of schools is kind of a double-edged sword. So, I mean, the local funding of schools largely developed naturally because schools were kind of local things.
Right.
And again, we had far more school districts historically than we have now, and they tended to reflect very local conditions and very small communities, and they would choose to fund their schools, and those schools were essentially what the community used. They were truly local schools. We've moved very far away from that. And there is I think, an equality problem of if you happen to be born in a school district where there's a high level of wealth, you will be able to raise more money locally for your schools, and your child will be in a better resource school than somebody in a poorer district. Now, there's limits to what resources do. They are not probably not the primary driver of outcomes at all. Kids who come from wealthier homes also tend to already have lots of advantages that have nothing to do with the schools. But I could see a sort of compromise where you say, okay, what we'll do is we will move away from local funding of schools, but instead of having government fund schools, government will provide money to families to choose the schools they want. Right. And they may equalize funding for all students, so every student might get, $15,000 or $14,000, around what's spent in many states, actually around $16,000 on a per pupil average. They would all get that money, and then they could choose to send it where they want. You could even have a state that said, okay, we'll give more to kids who have disabilities or non-native English speakers than kids who don't have those obstacles. But the crucial thing is, if you're going to change to that model, it has to be accompanied by the money following the students to schools their families choose, not the state essentially setting up the schools to which people will be assigned to based on their home addresses.
Neal McCluskey, director of the Center for Educational Freedom at the Cato Institute. His new book is Fractured Schoolhouse, Reexamining Education for a Free, Equal, and Harmonious Society. And you were just leading to the idea of school choice. Money follows the child school choice. I've had some raging debates on whether there should be government money involved in education at all, Neal, but it is, and it is here. What is your feeling? We have a governor and a lieutenant governor who are ardent on the idea of money follows the child school choice, yet once somebody, and I'll apply the word somebody to a government, has authority over something, I rarely see people willingly give it up to that degree. What do you think comes next in the school choice movement here in the Commonwealth of Virginia?
Well, there are two possibilities. There is an effort right now that's sort of coming together. It's sort of a grassroots organizing and bringing a coalition together to get education savings accounts. I think they're using a different term from that, but it's essentially the same thing. Education savings accounts for Virginia families. And an education savings account is basically an account in which, depending how you do it, it's usually a state puts money in an account for a student or in a student's name. You can do it where people get tax credits if they give money to groups that put together these education savings accounts. But the idea is this money goes into an account, and then you could use that money, or the family could use that money if they want to pay private school tuition, but it goes beyond that. It may be that you feel your child needs tutoring, so you could use it to pay for tutoring. You could have a child with special needs and then pay for therapies the child might need. So it goes beyond something that enables you to pay tuition to paying all sorts of for all sorts of educational needs outside of the public schools, but also maybe outside of private schooling, to bring on those tutors or therapists. And so that is something that's starting to to sort of gather steam in Virginia, this effort to put this together. And we've seen education savings accounts now for the first time be the first universal school choice program in a state. Arizona just passed a law that created universal ESA for their state, and it survived an effort to collect signatures to put it up to a referendum, the signature collectors hoping to defeat it in a referendum, and they didn't get enough signatures. So Arizona now has a statewide ESA program, and Virginia, it looks like it has people, at least, a growing coalition working for that. The other thing in Virginia is the state already has a scholarship tax credit program, in which people who donate to groups that put together scholarships for particular types of schools, so there's some for Montessori schools, for Catholic schools, for lots of different types of schools, they get a credit on their taxes for that donation. It's very small right now. It's only $25 million cap. That could also be expanded, but from what I've seen, most of the effort now is to move to this education savings account model.
Well, and full disclosure, one of the organizations in that grassroots organization is the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, the producer of this program. It's the Virginia Education Opportunity Alliance, and you can find out more about it at veoa.org. And we just had a great event with Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears. One of the issues I had with the scholarship program was that you still needed to be approved for it by the government, which meant that you had to fill out the forms and meet government established requirements for it, which just didn't sound like school choice to me at the onset of it. So I'm glad we're trying to move to something that the parents can tailor this to. What, Neal, is your feeling though on breaking up the number of school districts and getting it more localized? You mentioned, and it was a stunning percentage. I didn't realize how centralized we had all become. To do that, to get more individuality, more localism into the schools. Is there any hope of putting that back in the container?
Well, I mean, there is some possibility of becoming more localized. I think we have seen at least some more control return to the local level, not a whole lot, but with the demise of No Child Left Behind, there was a little bit of decentralization in that regard. But I don't think the focus should be on, well, do we split up government schools? Well, localism is good. That does tend to, I think it would end up replicating sort of these advantages that wealthier people have over less wealthy people. If you're in a big or a high property value district, or a district that has one part high property, one part low property, you're likely to see the high property value group split off. I think that's problematic. And then fundamentally, we don't want government deciding what is taught. We want that being something decided by free people. Millions of educators deciding what they think is most important, joined by millions of families freely deciding that they think that what an educator, what educator X is saying is important. is what they agree with. And so we need to move to a system where we no longer have government-supplied schools. It's where we may have government funding of some type or government assistance and funding going to students and then following them to what their families choose. That is how we end conflict over what the schools teach, or at least we diminish it. There will probably always be debates about what should be taught, but they won't be zero-sum about if I get what I want, you don't for your child. We want to move away from that. And we want to move generally to a system that is based in freedom. And it's actually through freedom that we see we're no longer forced into being kind of enemies with people we don't agree with. And we can find schools that stand for very specific things and can start building kind of cross-cutting identities for people. So you might be people from different races who go to like a Baptist school, and that being Baptist is what unites you, and that overcomes the differences of race. We could see that happen a lot more. So we've got to get away from the idea that government supplies schools and to the idea that we enable families to choose for themselves and free educators to decide for themselves how they think education should be run.
A news item in Virginia this week, 56% increase in the number of students homeschooling year over a year. Is homeschooling just one part? Because I know there's an awful lot of inertia behind homeschooling, but that's just one part of what we're talking about. It can't be the whole sum, correct, Neal?
Oh, yeah. So homeschooling is certainly a big part of it. We have seen a big increase in homeschooling. I think some of that is probably reflected in polls as a little bit of confusion about what people were doing when they were receiving their public schooling often, or charter schooling, which is also public schooling, at a computer at home. They may have thought that's what was meant by homeschooling. But we've definitely seen an increase in it. I think we will continue to see an increase in it. It had been growing even before COVID, and it's because people increasingly want to take charge of the education of their children, and that goes for many to the point where they don't think any schools are supplying what they want or that they can do it better. So I think we're going to definitely see a continued increase in homeschooling. It'll go up and down, but a general upward trend. But we're also seeing increases in enrollments in private schools. We've seen increase in interest in charter schools, which are like public-private hybrids. And I think that is going to continue, although COVID drove a lot of the very recent increases we've seen, and probably there'll be some stepping back from that when people feel that there's sort of normalcy returned to public schools and how they operate.
Is there a concern, because I've heard this, especially as it regards to regulating the gig economy, that there are legislators in Virginia that keep an eye on these homeschool cooperatives? There are many of them in central Virginia where parents band together and hire a couple of teachers and have use space in local churches and that kind of thing. And there are legislators that say, well, what's the borderline between when you're just a co-op of homeschool parents and a school that's hired teachers or that kind of thing? What is your thought as the author of Fractured Schoolhouse of these homeschool co-ops, and what is too big to be considered just a co-op of homeschool parents and has actually formed a school that may have to bring government regulation in on it?
Well, I mean, my feeling is that whether you are a school or not, you shouldn't be bringing down government regulation. And it's these sorts of things that might be considered a gray area show you actually how we should want education to develop, with all sorts of different arrangements that live or die based on whether or not families think they are a good use of money and are supplying a good educational outcome. So these kind of co-ops are sort of a tremendous middle way between homeschooling and private schooling, where parents, especially as kids get older, may not have expertise in specific subjects, and they say, let's get together with other homeschoolers and hire subject matter experts that we will go to 2 or 3 times a week to learn from them. I think that's terrific, and I think the state's job should be get out of the way and let that happen. Where I see some potential role for the state is we need to move to a system where what the state is concerned with, and it shouldn't be that concerned with it, but is, are kids learning? And as long as you don't have evidence that there are kids not learning, the state stays out of the way. If there are kids where there is evidence that they have learned no reading, no math, that they're not getting any education, then you would say, like with any form of neglect or suspicion of neglect, then authorities would do an investigation, and if the investigation finds enough evidence, then charges can be brought against parents, and then they get their day in court. In other words, we treat education the same way as we would treat, are you feeding your kids or something like that. That would be the role of the state. It is to safeguard that, or to step in when it's clear kids are being denied the education they need to eventually become self-governing adults. And in the vast majority of those cases, which I think would be very few, they would almost certainly be accompanied by other neglect that would be much more basic. Again, not getting proper food or shelter or clothing or something, or, a combination of those things. But otherwise, we should let free people make free decisions about what education looks like for them.
And the better we educate them, the better they can make those choices as well. And it becomes a self-fulfilling rather than a self-defeating cycle. Neal McCluskey is on with us from the Cato Institute, and as their namesake in Roman times, trying to fend off the decline of our values. I want to ask an economic question, and you can demur. It's not my expertise, though. I as a talk show host, I generally have to a jock of many trades, master of none. But economically speaking, one of the things that I hear often regarding the expansion of the public school into breakfast and evening care and pre-K, and President Biden talks about, as young as 2 years old, bring them in, is the economic side of what's happening to the American family. Two income families are becoming three income families. Single parent households are single parent with two jobs, and time for the student at home becomes a challenge, and so the government says, "Oh, we can help." And does there need to be, while this movement towards educational choice going on, a movement to try to develop a better economic landscape for parents so they don't need three jobs? They can spend more time with their kids on while working the two jobs they have. Understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, this is not something I've delved into as much as the sort of social conflict, social cohesion issues. But, you have a real sort of chicken and egg question. So do we have a lot more people saying, well, let's have both parents work and let's maybe work very long hours because we have public schools that supply free child care for much of the day? If we were to extend government funding to universal preschool, would you see more parents say, okay, now is the time to get another job and to bring in more money? We have a fundamental problem of people make different decisions when something is paid for that they use using not their money but someone else's money. And we see that in public schooling. We see a big problem with that in higher education, where a major reason the price is so high is because people use a lot of money that's not theirs, but that's taken from taxpayers. And so my suspicion is that if we were to increasingly, certainly connect the money to students, if we connect money to students in K through 12, we'd start seeing people choosing all sorts of different arrangements. Some people may choose the school that focuses on math and has traditional school hours. Some may focus on or choose a school that, does a perfectly adequate job in lots of subjects, but also provides aftercare. And parents who really need that aftercare, value that aftercare, would pay for that. We need to increasingly move to a system where people are making decisions for themselves, how the money that's supposed to supply something for them is used. And increasingly we should say, and also you need to supply some of this money yourself. And so you'd have school choice, but you'd also say, look, if you want something extra, you top up with some of your own money. And so that moves us more and more to where we see people making decisions based on their own finances and their own, valuation of everything against everything else. And I think you'd see a system that is much more efficient and much more rational about how kids are cared for in and out of school take place or go into place, because people would be making disciplined decisions,
right.
Not decisions based on, well, someone else paid for this, I might as well use it and go do something else.
And with the less money government then would need to take out of the economy, then there would be more money for the individual and so on and so forth. It is the cycle in reverse. Neal McCluskey, the book is The Fractured Schoolhouse, Reexamining Education for a Free, Equal, and Harmonious State. Last question, and this one's a political one. And it's really a call out to both political parties in Virginia. You mentioned Arizona earlier, where they did, real money follows the child's school choice. I've talked to folks both in Arizona and Nevada where they flirted with this for a while, that this really is a winning story in both the poor, underserved, if you want to use the phrase, black communities, but especially the Latino communities. And if there's a unifying message, it's that both of these communities really like the idea of being able to choose. You see it in the D.C. Opportunity Scholarship programs as well. But, especially you mentioned language barriers and that kind of thing. For the political parties who are seeing the changing landscape, and you mentioned also earlier a less Caucasian landscape, this is a winning issue for them, and we should be able to build a coalition politically behind it, don't you think?
Well, it's certainly the highest support for school choice is typically expressed by minority families. There's no doubt also a correlation with income, but African American and Hispanic families typically have the highest level of support for school choice because they are the least well served by public schooling, generally speaking. And so we shouldn't be surprised by that. They are the ones who have suffered from a system that has been least friendly to them, especially African Americans. I mean, I talk about it a great deal in my book. That, look, for most of the history of public schooling, first government actually said in many places African Americans were not allowed to receive an education. Right. Then when they finally were, they said, okay, but if they get one, it has to be in totally separate schools. And then even after Brown v. Board of Education in the 1950s, after that, and after a decade or two of states dragging their feet to integrate schools, when they did integrate them physically, they often said, but look, most of the teachers are going to be white, most of the administrators are going to be white. African American teachers and administrators lost their jobs in great numbers, and so the system has never been friendly to African Americans, and so we shouldn't be at all surprised when they say we still don't like it. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, we see, for instance, charter schools are often, people say, well, they are segregated. And they say they're segregated not because they're in any sort of official way segregated. Often what we see are African Americans say, we want schools that reflect us, that are governed by other African Americans, that teach what we think is important to teach, that reflect our culture. And this isn't something that we should say is a bad thing. We should want people to be able to find the education they think is most fulfilling. And for African Americans in particular, that has never been the public schooling system.
Mm-hmm. Neal, I deeply appreciate your time. You've been very gracious with it. Is the best place to get the book, Fractured Schoolhouse, at cato.org, or should we go to Amazon, make you one of the bestsellers? What should we be doing to pick up your book, especially for Christmas gift giving? Yes, I said it already. But it's never too early to think about that. Where should we get the book?
Well, you can definitely get it at Amazon.com. You can get it, I think, at any online bookseller. But you can go to Cato's website, and there is a page for it. And it, I think, has links to at least Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and I think one or two others if you want to shop around.
And the website's worth it just for all the things you can get from there anyway, beyond the book as well. Neal, thank you so much for your visit this week, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Great. Thanks.
We'll be right back with more Freedom and Prosperity Radio. And a quick reminder, our organization is the Virginia Education Opportunity Alliance. We are part of it, and you can find out more about that at veoa.org.